Alright, what we're working on here is a 95 Saturn SC1. This is a project that somebody else started. So we have to figure out if we have all the bolts for it and all the stuff for it. And as you can see, some of the stuff we found, like this, but we got lines that go places like this. Right here, it goes up here, just dead ends. We have no connection back here, so obviously it doesn't hook up to the intake manifold. So let's figure out stuff like, where does that hose go? And does the AC compressor have enough bolts? You can see there's 4 there, and then another bracket on the side there. This one's got 2 more bolts. And if we move it around, we can see some of them are missing on the front. So we have to figure out how that bolts on and if we have enough bolts. Down here, now I took this water jacket off, or this thermostat housing off, so I know the bolts are for it, but this is one of the bolts for the AC compressor that goes through that, to these holes right here. There's 2 there and there's 2 up here. This is the bottom 2 right here, and then the other 2 bolt on to the head after the head's on. So what I've done is we've now got all the parts laid out here, and as you can see, some of them have bolts, some of them don't. This bracket here, you can see all the bolts are in it. We got a crank bolt for the crank pulley. We got a bolt missing here. And see, these are pretty easy to figure out because you can see how short that is. You can tell it doesn't go in this one because there's not enough sticking out. That one there, that's got all of its bolts. That's the motor mount bracket. There's some brackets for the slides for the chain guides. And there's a tensioner for the chain, and see, it's only got 1 bolt. This is the power steering bracket. All the bolts are there for it. And one of the ways you can tell whether you got the right bolts in the right places is by looking at the wear right here. See how that's a clear mark? And when you put the bolt down through, see, you can see that it's lined up. And of course you got 3 of one size and 3 of another size. See, there's different length in them bolts, so you can tell which ones go in which holes. This cover, same way. You know, you got same number of bolts as you got holes, all the same length. And you got one weird one here. That's the only one that would fit into that hole, so you pretty much know that's it. And we don't have any nuts for the exhaust manifold studs, so we know we got to get nuts for them. We got to get one of those. We got to get one of these. That's on. We got both the bolts and the valve cover. Excuse the leaves. We got a little wind here yesterday, so things got a little crazy. We got just the bottom half of the air intake. That bracket there and the oil pan and all of that, I already know I got all the bolts for it because I took it off. It was still on the car. So back over here to the car, we know we only have 3 or 2 of the bolts that go into the power steering, so we're gonna have to get that. I did look, I've got the head in a different place, but I got all the nuts for the studs that go into the intake manifold, so that's there. But we got this tube here coming out that goes into the air cleaner right there. Goes into that, and we got a line coming out here. We have to figure out where that goes, and that line coming out of there comes out of the top of that cover about right here and goes that way. So as you can see, there's not a whole lot over that way. This is fuel hose right here, and there isn't anything else in here. So there's a lot of little things that you have to figure out. And one of the things that I have done or learned to do is, when you're missing stuff like this, or you're working on a project that you've never worked on that doesn't have all its parts, one of the best things you can do is to go to the salvage yard and find one that's complete, and then you can see how it's put together. And once you see how it's put together, then it helps you to see what you're missing and how it's supposed to be when it's all finished. And so that's the next step, is to go to the yard and get the rest of the bolts that I need and figure out what all's missing and get the parts I need. Okay, so we went to the salvage yard and we discovered that this hose that I was looking at earlier, that I pointed out, connects to a line, comes over here and goes across and hooks onto a connection on the head. We found the upper intake box. We also found this hose right here. See, there's a gap between here and up here where it's supposed to go. So apparently this was cut off for some reason. So I got the right hose to go back on it. And I got all the rest of the nuts that I needed. And also got a battery box, battery tie down. There's a strap that goes in over top of the battery right here. But so the trip to the salvage yard was quite useful in answering questions. The big one being where this went and why there were brackets on the valve cover, because there's one of the bolt holes for this, and then this ties onto a bracket that sticks up right here. But anyway, so a lot of times, say, going to the salvage yard and getting your parts that you need, getting a list of stuff that you think you need, and looking at other things, a lot of time will give you a lot of answers in how things are supposed to go. And like for example, if you were having issues trying to figure out how this AC compressor was mounted, you know, going to the yard will tell you. This is pretty straightforward though. I mean, it's hard to do with one hand while you're wrestling around here, but you can kind of see here, once you get to the thing over here, that, you know, it's pretty straightforward how it attaches. You got two bolts here, you know, one bolt's up here and the other one's down here. These two go right here, you know. So I mean, it's pretty straightforward once you see it. But and it gives you an idea of the difficulty in putting stuff back together, or the simplicity of putting stuff back together. That took me a couple of hours at the salvage yard, because one of the bolts that I had to get was down underneath here. This little deal right here is where that I'll show you that this little guy right here bolts to, and I had to get one of these bolts and for this, so I had to take that cover off. This cover here is what goes over it, and as you can see, that's where that cover came out of. This little gap right here. So there's not a whole lot of room in there, and it took a little doing to get it out, but it also gives you an idea what you're in for when you're putting it back together and how to put it back together. So just take your time and look at the signs. There's always a way to figure out how to put something back together. And this works for people those of you that have taken stuff apart and left it set for so long that you don't exactly remember how it all came apart. Lay it out, put your bolts in it, find all your bolts, and it'll come together. It'll come together. It's pretty easy, really. See this bolt right here? This is the one that bolts into that bracket. It's that piece of tubing. Anyway, this little line here goes over into the to right here on this intake. That tube just goes straight across, and that was one of the things that I got to see when I was at the yard. I figured out that tube went straight across over to the valve cover. All right, and then there's another line coming out of the valve cover right here. This one here comes out of the valve cover, and it goes onto this right here. The valve cover is like over here, so it definitely simplifies things when you get to see how it all goes together. And then if you're worried about it, or have one that you're working on and want to know how it goes back together, go find one in a salvage yard that's still together and take pictures of it. That's another way to solve the problem. But I've been doing this long enough that I know where everything, I know what it does, what it's for, and pretty much where it goes. Just a matter of making sure that it's connected in the right place. That's the big key. You don't want your vacuum lines hooked to your fuel lines, or your fuel connections, or vice versa. Or I saw a guy one time hooked a fuel line up to a vacuum tube on a carburetor and filled the motor plumb full of fuel, and locked it up. So can create some interesting scenarios when that happens. Alright, that's it for this.